it's crazy, but it's
You're watching Channel Z, the world's leading zombie apocalypse channel, broadcasting live from Studio Z.
Makes me act the way I do.
Undead Live, evening edition, reporting from the front lines of the zombie apocalypse. We have your back morning, noon, and night, whether you're dead, undead, recently deceased, or still fully alive. Today is Saturday, October 17th. I'm Athena Aktipis.
And I'm Dave Lundberg-Henrik. And this evening we'll see how new technology is reanimating old zombies and explore the truth behind conspiracy theories.
But first, let's bring on our frontline correspondents, Larry and Steve. You guys, I cannot wait to hear what has been going on.
So they're not going to be on again. Well, not that they're not going to ever be on, but once again, we can't get a hold of them.
What do you mean? I thought they were going to be on with us tonight, Dave.
So we haven't heard anything from Steve since we got that other video, and now we've got this video from Larry, and
so there's a video though, so maybe you can show that and we can see how Larry's doing.
Let's take a look.
Okay.
I'm heading up the stairs. I feel like the only place to go is the attic. Close it up now. Schloss. Hey, I hope you get this. So, broadcasting from my new headquarters. I'm up in the attic. There's my prison door, and I'm just gonna try to hang out here. I got my vittles, and I don't know quite what I'm hiding from. I don't know if the zombies are gonna get me or the fucking militia. I guess that's what this always ends up being about. I got a window on the world up here. We'll just see. Kind of see what's going on out there, and I'm just gonna hope that maybe the folks at Channel Z know where I am and they'll send some help. Otherwise I'll just have to stick it out. All right, over and out, buddy.
Dave, where are they? Where's Larry? Where's Steve? Could you tell from where the video came from?
I mean, I think that's his house, and he clearly said at the end he needs someone to send help, but I don't know.
But he didn't tell us where he lives.
Right, and I think Steve knows, but we can't get a hold of Steve.
Shit.
So it's somewhere in New York, I think it's right, but it's a big state.
Zilikazi, I agree. This is super scary. I really hope Steve and Larry are okay. We're gonna keep our ears peeled for information.
Yeah. So Alana asked a really interesting question. Attic, not basement, right? He went up to I hate to sort of talk about his situation like he's our guinea pig, but is the attic the right move rather than the basement?
I don't know. I mean, Pam points out that you can jump out of the window, and Alana says, you can keep track of the days. So, I mean, I guess if it's a long-term thing, but you know what? I don't really want to talk about this anymore. I don't want to think about it. Let's get on with our show. Yeah, let's get on with our show. So first tonight, we welcome Robin Nelson, an anthropologist and evolutionary biologist, to talk with us about technology and race, specifically the ways that new technology can reinforce the marginalization of minoritized populations. Welcome to Undead Live, Robin.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Great to have you. We're looking forward to hearing all of your insights. You have the floor.
All right. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Black zombies and the white imagination. For the purposes of this talk, you might be wondering what the white imagination is. Well, in actuality, it's the lens through which white people see, consider, consume, and reinvent everything around them. And well, since the Race Project began around the 1700s, white people have been consuming Blackness and reimagining it to serve their own ends. So in the before times, you might wonder when we first start hearing about the concept of the zombie. Well, we start seeing it present itself in film in this 1932 film called White Zombie. And the film White Zombie, it might be 1936 actually, it's actually takes place in Haiti, as many early discussions of zombies do. So what is it about Haiti? Well, there of course is the conception of zombies that come from white understandings of voodoo practices, but there's also the overarching fear of Black bodies and Black minds and the things that Black people know and that they could do to damage white people. It's the binary that we see playing out in Haiti of civilization versus wild. And we have to remember that at this time, what's happened is that Haiti is the home to the only successful slave revolt in the Western Hemisphere. And so the rest of the world, France, Great Britain, and the United States, are going to make sure they pay a steep price for not allowing their bodies to be used for this benefit. In the film White Zombie, a white man tries to use voodoo to capture his white wife and force her to love him forever in a zombie state. But he too is taken as a zombie until he kills the Black Haitian voodoo master, whose death then sets them free. We also are all probably pretty familiar with Night of the Living Dead, kind of classic zombie film, which is tackles the relationship, not explicitly, but definitely implicitly, between race and zombie bodies. You might be wondering, like, what makes a zombie? What are we looking at when we think about zombies? And this will tie into discussion around tech. Well, we know zombies have an appetite for non-normal foods, right? Flesh or brains. We see a change in their affect and a change in their cadence. And so from this shot here, from Pride and Prejudice and Zombies from 2016, we start to see this woman turning. She's just turned into a zombie, so her body doesn't look different yet. But we start to see these changes in bodily habitus, the way they move. And of course, we know, depending on what kinds of zombies we're looking at, they either move very slowly or very quickly, but they're not moving normally. They don't sound normal. And so the key is identifying that difference, and identifying that difference, that deviation from what is actually human, is what might keep you alive. So we have to ask ourselves in this particular moment, are we living in the before times, or are we already in an apocalyptic moment? What would you need to see to know that you were living through an apocalyptic moment? How would we know if the creatures around us were not quite human? Well, how would you know? Maybe you would hear news reports rather about a virus. Maybe you would hear news reports about something that was coming that you needed to watch out for, and that you needed to keep your distance from people around you. We know that's happening right now. Perhaps you would hear reports of panic shopping, runs on toilet paper, runs on water, shortages of flour and yeast and potting soil and seeds. Maybe there would be really long lines to complete our most basic civil tasks like voting. Maybe there would be changes in our routine, like increased hand washing, extreme caution in public wearing a mask, everyone wearing a mask, increased rates of anxiety and depression and stress and isolation amongst individuals living through this particular moment. And maybe people would start wanting to protect themselves. We would see an increase in gun sales, no contact drop-offs, fortifying one's home and separating one's home from the general public. Well, what if we're already there? What if some people are already protecting themselves from others who they deem to be not quite as human as they are? What if the fortification and isolation and fear began a very long time ago? And what if for some people, the zombie apocalypse has been happening for such a long time, and it's been creeping along and haunting them? And what if people have always been afraid of the power and sickness of others, and contagion has always been a threat? What would that look like, and how would you protect yourself? This is a picture from New Orleans of a segregated housing residence that is all white. Kleinfontein in South Africa is a segregated community where only white Afrikaners can live and can settle. This picture was taken in 2015. So you have to start asking yourself, what is the fear and what are they keeping out? In Australia, we can see this comic from 1965, where Aboriginal children are being painted white by their parent so that they would be able to enter into a swimming pool. So we see these spaces where there's always been a risk of contagion or threat of contagion by some people, and other people have been trying to survive. So who are the zombies? And every classic zombie film asks this question: who are the zombies? Who is human? And who gets to decide? So when we started thinking about how we perceive humanity, one nice case study we have about whether or not we are living in a post-apocalyptic moment is Henrietta Lacks and the use of her cells. So Henrietta Lacks, you might have heard her case, died in 1951. And there was a cell line that was harvested from her cervix. She had a very aggressive form of cancer. And that cell line lived on despite being removed from her body, which previously had been very hard to do. To keep the cell line alive had been very difficult. So perhaps we could have had cell lines from any patient, but it's no mistake that this line of undead cells was harvested from a Black person, someone perceived as less than human, less deserving of the basic ethics and rights afforded to other patients already. How else would you know whether you were in a zombie moment, a post-apocalyptic or apocalyptic moment? Well, what if you couldn't be seen in film? So Kodak, one of the kind of early film developing companies, used what was called the Shirley card to develop their film palettes, the color palettes. Shirley was named after Shirley Page, who was an employee of Kodak, and she was used by photo labs to calibrate skin tones, shadows, and light during the printing process. The legacy of using a white woman to typify what are normal human skin tones lives on, to the point that when Annie Leibovitz shot, I'm blanking her name. She's a famous gymnast, Black famous gymnast, Simone Biles. For a cover of Vogue, she looked terrible. the shading and the coloring on the photos were bad, and Annie Leibovitz was criticized roundly for how Simone showed up in those photos, and that's a legacy of the Shirley card. In 2019, Jamie Morgenstern, a researcher at Georgia Institute of Technology, released a study, a preprint of a study that showed that you were more likely to be hit by a self-driving vehicle if you had darker skin. And the way that it was stated in one article reviewing this on Vox was that automatic vehicles may be better at detecting pedestrians with lighter tones. But the automatic vehicles aren't the ones who are better at detecting, right? Someone has to program the automatic vehicles. Someone is telling them who to perceive as human and who to perceive as not quite human. Rochester Institute of Technology, Rensselaer Institute of Technology, some engineering students there realized that darker skin tones were absorbing more light, and thus light was not being reflected back up to the sensors at public sinks. And so for many Black people, we have gone into public areas, public sinks, public bathrooms, and we reach under the soap and we reach under the sink, and it never comes out until you turn and twist and turn and twist your hand. I thought for years that really that was because these are just not great technology. But in fact, my skin tone is not perceived as human. And there is good evidence for that that's actually a technological problem. So what is an apocalypse and what is a post-apocalyptic life? In this moment, we need to ask ourselves if we are already there, and if we were already there even before coronavirus struck and COVID-19 struck. Native scholars and indigenous scholars around the world have often said, and particularly I think I've heard Kim Tallbear talk about the fact that Native populations are already living through a post-apocalyptic moment. What counts as post-apocalyptic? Well, you're removed from your land, you have reduced resources, people are policing your body, you can't move freely, your humanity isn't recognized. So what do we know about post-apocalyptic or an apocalyptic life right at this particular moment? We know the people that are most vulnerable are often people of color. And so if we look at this graph from the Comptroller of New York City, the frontline workers as identified by race and ethnicity across different fields from grocery stores to building cleaners are often Latino or Hispanic, Black, and Asian. And then if we look and see what the pandemic that we're living through at this particular moment, what communities it has damaged the most and killed the most. We have Black or African American communities, American Indian or Alaska Native communities, Hispanic and Latino communities are being most vulnerable in this particular moment. So if we return to film as kind of a metaphor for explaining to us what it means to be living through a zombie apocalypse, in the final few scenes of a new zombie classic called The Girl with All the Gifts that came out in 2016, we're forced to recognize, and the little girl in the film was forced to recognize, that she was being used as a test subject. And the white folks who were doing, the white scientists who were doing the research on her understood that she was in fact not all zombie, that she did feel things, that she was alive. But they wanted to use her body nonetheless to develop a vaccine. She does away with those scientists, and she keeps a helpful teacher that you can see here in the background and supports the other children who are also part zombie and part human. But throughout the film, it becomes very clear that she was not in a position of power to save herself from people who are actually treating her in inhumane ways. And if we return to Night of the Living Dead, in the very last scene, George Romero really kind of foreshadows topics that are still troubling today. Ben, the remaining Black character who is identified as being a resourceful African American in this film, he comes out after everybody that he's with are turned into zombies and die. He's the last one alive. He comes out because the police show up, hands up, ready to kind of be saved, and is actually shot because it's assumed that he is a zombie too. And so I think in closing, I want us to think a bit about who are actually the undead. Who are the ones who are unable to perceive humanity, who don't have empathy, who consume things that they probably shouldn't be consuming? And what are the signs of the undead? Are we talking about differences in body? Or are we talking about differences in expressions of humanity? So as we live through this particular apocalyptic moment, let's make sure that we interrogate quite a bit how we identify who is human and how we identify who is undead. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. So much to think about there. The comments are kind of going crazy. I'm going to invite Mozilla Kazi in to join us too. She had a lot of great comments as we were going, and I think lots of resonance with what Mozilla Kazi was talking about in our Brain Dead Theater last night as well.
Absolutely.
So.
We had some of the same clip, reaching to Night of the Living Dead and White Zombie as really central implications for unpacking race here and conceptions of race. And your talk just had me so excited thinking through all these connections and the ways in which Black folks have been framed as the undead or the living dead, right? From the HeLa cells, from which they never told her family about them or herself, right? Such that she wasn't even perceived as human enough to let her or her family know about these cells that would go on to save so many people later. To also thinking to the girl with all the gifts and this idea of saving oneself and really framing that, thinking through Black people specifically, but you can think of people of color within the Americas or here in the US, and this idea of how do you save oneself? Are you capable of saving oneself? It makes me think of these protests, like whether this summer or back in the 1960s, where folks were wearing the signs, "I am a man," right? To have to try to argue and affirm one's humanity to those who see you as less than human, as persistently less than human.
No, absolutely. I mean, I kind of had to keep the talk a little bit condensed, but some of the things I was thinking about is, we could talk about Tuskegee, we could talk about the HeLa cells, we can talk about all kinds of, we can talk about the early origins, Marion Sims, and the early origins of gynecological research, and the ways that Black bodies were constantly seen as useful, but really disposable, right? They could be used in any particular way that was useful, but as soon as they weren't, they're not. And so when we think about new tech, right, we know that tech companies have a real problem with diversity. And the way that is showing up is that the algorithms that they're creating don't even acknowledge that there are humans that have darker skin. And so I think that, the ripple effects of this kind of identification of whiteness as a human norm are really quite profound.
Yeah, so we have a comment here. I put it up while the talk was going on, but I just want to bring it up again. Pam said that she had no idea that segregation was still happening in South Africa. And I'm wondering, more generally, what is the landscape of segregation globally? Is this something that is still very much alive?
Yes, absolutely. And so, I chose that. I wanted to choose a few examples from South Africa, Australia, so we could think about the kind of global experience of Blackness, even in places where Black people are the indigenous community and when Black people are the kind of majority community. So the idea of a minority actually doesn't work, right? So sometimes I say minoritized individuals to kind of identify the fact that this is a process that people have enacted and that it's not a natural state that Black people are the smallest percentage of the population. But we know that even in the United States, segregation is an incredibly challenging issue. School segregation, housing segregation. There's a podcast a host and writer for NPR named Gene Demby, and he has this kind of hashtag where he says housing segregation and everything, where if you look across kind of health differences in the United States, schooling differences in the United States, policing in the United States, it all comes down to segregation around housing. And we see that still happening in lots of places around the world where there are still exclusively white gated communities and areas where there are just mostly minoritized individuals living there.
And my understanding also is that, it's not always just a matter of sort of explicitly enforced segregation, but sometimes just, the practices of landlords and that, combined with systematic racism can create and maintain segregation, even if there are sort of broader efforts to try to desegregate.
Sure. I think of the persistent kind of racial fantasy, right, of plantations, right, the persistent use of plantations for weddings, or gated communities called plantation so and so or plantation so another, right? I mean, it is the fantasy of being able to go back, right, to a persistent segregation. Robin, I wanted to ask you, what are the implications for this AI and considering it's using and being brought up to being used by police departments? What are the implications there?
Oh, so the interesting thing about, so the way AI is being used in police departments is fascinating. So we know that they're using a lot of kind of algorithmic tools to understand who is quote unquote more likely to be committing crimes and what areas they should police more heavily. And those are all kind of based on data that is already slightly biased. And so you already have data where certain communities have been over-policed. And so now we're going to give those communities more attention. So we start to see things where we think that technology is going to fix things, but it never quite does. So we say things like, well, we just need to get some body cameras. If we get some body cameras on the cops, then we'll be okay. But in fact, we know that cops can turn on and off their body cameras, and that still doesn't change who and where they're policing. And so I will say this, tech alone is not going to save us. And I think particularly, I live in Silicon Valley, we see people lean into tech as a solution for all kinds of social ills. And tech is not going to save us when it's kind of the foundation of it is this very kind of human, non-human dichotomy between people of color and white folks.
We have a great comment here from Jessica Brinkworth. So Jessica gave a talk the other day about how COVID is fundamentally affecting people who are disadvantaged differently because of different biology that's a result of a history of having disadvantages. And so she says that, the segregation gets embodied in the biology, right, through this life experience, and then reinforced by tech. What do you think are the most important ways that tech is kind of reinforcing these boundaries that we might not want to be, having be there?
Well, so if we think about, I could use any number of examples, but if we think about just about film, let's just stay with film. Let's just stay with who counts as beautiful and who counts as worthy of a magazine cover. So we know that fashion is a very segregated industry. You could probably name the handful of Black and Latino, Afro-Latino models that have made it very big. And the way that tech is like reinforcing that segregation, particularly in that industry, is that if the film is set up in a way that you have to actually take an extra few steps for darker skinned people to look for their skin to show up appropriately on film, then they're not going to get the same callbacks for jobs. Their pictures will not be seen as worthy. It'll be seen as extra effort. This shows up in all kinds of ways. One other way very quickly is makeup, right? So Rihanna kind of hit it very big recently with her makeup line. But part of the reason why her makeup line was such a hit is because it had this vast arrangement of skin tones that it accounted for in the palette, which we know that if you go into your local Target, Revlon does not have, Maybelline doesn't have. And lots of folks in the fashion industry talk about the fact that before you even get to film, before you even get shot, you don't have makeup that properly represents your skin. And so many Black models will talk about bringing their own makeup and their own hairdressers to make sure that they can supply themselves with the appropriate resources before they even get shot by film that will not properly represent their skin.
Yeah. Ms. Ilikazi, do you want to jump in about any of these other issues with technology kind of reinforcing these, the disadvantage or segregation that we see?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm thinking about all of your examples, Robin, about technology here. And it's also making me think of the ways in which people of color and Black people are trying to engage with technology as a form of self-defense, right? So whether it be filming encounters with the police through the use of smartphones. I wonder if you could speak to, are there any, given your comments on technology, are there any other spaces for resistance? Is it just that we're going to be caught up in AI and that's that? Or are there spaces that you see or can envision folks kind of pushing back against this narrative and tech?
Sure, absolutely. So, one of the fascinating things about kind of watching how minoritized communities mount resistance to their own dehumanization over time is that we know that they use the resources available in ways that are creative and new all the time. And so, like Ms. Kazi said, you have folks recording all encounters with police. You also have folks, I'm thinking of Sarah Cooper on TikTok. She's a Jamaican woman. She has her videos imitating Donald Trump, right? And it got so kind of intense, the criticism of Donald Trump, through this, what could be seen as a very kind of lightweight, kind of kiddie, I don't want to say kiddie in a disrespectful way, but just kind of an easygoing kind of tech innovation, TikTok, that he wanted to shut down TikTok. And so you see these ways that journalism, reporting, all of this has become democratized through even tech companies that have their own challenges. Like Twitter has had a lot of problems with white supremacists on the site, death threats against women and people of color. At the same time, because of Twitter, we understood what was happening in Ferguson. We understood what's happening in Minnesota. We are allowed to see those things because minoritized communities are using this same tech that's not set up for them to their own advantage. So there's tons of ways to be resistant, even though the tech is actually dehumanizing in other ways.
So Robin and Ms. Ilikazi, I want to bring back up a comment here that Emily made during your talk, Robin, about Night of the Living Dead. And I'm going to pull her into our feed, actually, so she can tell us her thoughts about Night of the Living Dead. Emily.
Hi there.
So remind us what exactly happened in terms of the process of this story getting made into a movie.
So what I was referring to is that the book, The Girl with All the Gifts, the character Melanie is a young white girl, and she is actually quoted in the book as saying her skin is white as snow, and that her teacher is actually a Black woman, and she comments on the darkness of her skin. And then in the film version, we have the teacher as a white actor and Melanie as a Black actor. And that's such a interesting example of what some people call race bending, right? Where you change the race of a character in a narrative and it doesn't do anything to the plot, but it adds additional layers of meaning. And the same thing happened with Night of the Living Dead, where George Romero famously said he didn't, and doubled down on it, he didn't cast the Black actor Dwayne Jones because he was Black, but because he was simply the best actor. But in a movie released in 1968, and knowing Romero's own political leanings, to me as a scholar, I think it's impossible that he didn't know what he was doing. So I think this is just a really interesting conversation about how zombies and film in general, how even if a character's race, particularly a Black character's race, is not outwardly discussed in a narrative, because of the social environment that we live, especially in the United States, these things gain additional layers of meaning.
Yeah. Robin, do you want to respond to that?
No, absolutely. I was reading that, casting Ben as a Black man was extremely controversial at the time. It was him dying at the end the way he did after being so resourceful that he could survive throughout the entire film was kind of amazing. And I think about with Girl with All the Gifts, if they would have kept it flip-flopped the way that it was in the book, it would have been a completely different story about, the Black teacher who was saving the young white girl, right? And so instead, you get this flip-flop away from a kind of what could have been critiqued as a white savior kind of trope. And instead, we have a completely different narrative that we have to interrogate, which is about how we deal with people who are kind of she's kind of liminal, like she's kind of in the middle in that story.
Absolutely, which makes total sense because zombies are inherently liminal. So when you add people who are already on the quote unquote fringes of society or who live in these liminal states, you're just adding more complexity to the stories. And I think that's what makes them so much more significant. I mean, don't get me wrong. Night of the Living Dead is a great film cinematography wise and acting. And Romero did change in a lot of ways the way we view zombies today, but that film had impact because of Dwayne Jones and because of how it ended. And even if Romero says that he didn't intend to have this, civil rights narrative going on in Black Power, the ending credits are over what look like lynching scenes of Ben being hooked and dragged onto a fire with undead bodies. And I think that we can't escape what was trying to do. And I like to say that the intent of the director and the writers and the actors is only one facet of art. The way the audience interprets it is a whole nother can of worms. And ultimately, those are the people that give it the meaning that's distributed throughout our society.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, Ms. Ilikazi, do you want to add anything?
I'm just riveted. I mean, it really continues on this thinking through the consumption of Black bodies, thinking through the use. And I'm still thinking about the girl with the gifts, really, and the way in which that plays out, and the way in which the teacher is like really, she's so troubled by the questions around the humanity of this Black child, right? And it, sure, it's a zombie movie, but that relationship, I mean, I can just see it replaying throughout our history again and again and again. The ways in which Black bodies have been consistently dehumanized, and these sparks of folks who are like, wow, like they seem like humans, they seem to have feelings, So I of course love the zombie portion of that, but it really just takes me back how this is replayed, the constant way where we have to affirm, I'm real, I have feelings. So it's all, there's so much we could keep going.
Zombies are never about the undead. It's always about the living and the systems of oppression and institutions that exist within those living environments, the before times, if you will. And then the after times just exacerbate or put additional pressure on the already stressed systems of our society.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I mean, I was thinking about this, because I chose to kind of highlight some films where there are very clear kind of racial dynamics at play with the casting and with the plot. But there's also zombie films like Train to Busan where, where we're talking about Korean culture. The film is in Korean. It's not created to be consumed by a white public, right? And so there are different dynamics at play, but it's still exactly what Emily was saying about, the inequalities that are already happening and how they're kind of played out or exacerbated or undone in the after times or in the apocalyptic moment. So you have all this kind of class stuff that gets shifted around because, as I was watching all of these films in the past few weeks, one thing that my husband, who never watches zombie films, he's not a horror buff at all, but one thing he said is the inevitability of the zombies, the hordes, right? And the hordes are what kind of undo the structures that are so comfortable. And that's in part why I wanted to show you the pictures of segregated housing, because what people are trying to prevent are the hordes. The hordes from undoing what they consider to be the best and the most appropriate hierarchical structures in their society.
So I know that there's no way that we can bring up Train to Busan without giving Emily the floor for a moment. So
No, sorry. I love Train to Busan. I think it's one of the best zombie movies of all time. Definitely my favorite in the last 10 years. But again, I think this is going back to what I was saying. It's not just about the zombies or how the movie is cinematography wise. It's because you watch that movie, and as someone who knows very little about Korean culture, it's still very clear that that is about social class and social upward movement, because you literally have the people in the back of the train trying to get to the front and then are stopped by the man in like the business suit. So even if you know nothing about the society, it's those problems are still relevant in other places in the world that we can recognize them. And I think that's what's so powerful about art or about these fictional narratives, right? I mean, we're all here because we found some kind of entry point in something that some people would dismiss as just a horror movie. But yeah, I think Train to Busan is fantastic. And I think Girl with All the Gifts, and the same thing that is underlining all of this is that we need different people, meaning people other than white people, telling zombie stories and zombie narratives so that we can get more of these stories and this commentary that is so important.
Yeah, thank you, Emily. It strikes me that, Train to Busan also brings forward how, a lot of these narratives, they might look like they're about race on one level, but really underlying that is this sort of history of sort of the structural issues. And with Train to Busan, right? I mean, you don't see a difference in the way that the characters look from the front of the train to the back of the train, but it's very clear that they have these different backgrounds and histories that have put them in these different positions, in the front or in the back.
Sure. It seems that zombie movies really have this way of highlighting this like naturally intersectional dynamic here, right? So we can unpack the race and the class tensions, and particularly, Robin, as you remind us, the fear of the hordes, right? So it's about like as much about keeping certain people in and a lot more people out. So.
Yeah, we have a comment question here from Liz Grumbaugh. She says, the idea of the hordes brings up this point kind of from earlier today about the language that gets used to talk about zombies, and talking about them as a horde, as a they, instead of as individual humans. And also, when they're talked about individually, being talked about as it's, as opposed to, using human based pronouns. So what are your guys' thoughts about these issues? Robin, do you want to take this first?
Sure. I mean, so the parallels that I was thinking about for my own talk was the way that we do this kind of in-group, out-group stuff with language when we think about race, but also with zombies. With Girl with All the Gifts, it was very clear they didn't quite know how to deal with her. Some people referred to her as it, and some people referred to her as, it's a girl, and they referred to her as her name. And we see this same kind of dehumanization of marginalized folks all the time, where we don't really know. And when I say we, I'm actually not talking about me. I'm talking about proverbial we, or kind of white America in this case. How to think about a group of Black men. How do we think about a group of Black teenage girls? How do we think about a group of Black women having a good time? And I'm thinking about the case on the wine train. I don't know if you remember this incident a few years ago, where there was a group of Black women who were taking a trip up in Napa Valley area in California, and they got kicked off of this wine train, where the whole point of the train, it's kind of like a booze cruise, is to drink and have fun with your friends, but they were loud. And that loudness to the people on the train was not seen as within the range of what is acceptable, normal, human, social behavior. And so this kind of us, them language, and the way that even when we're not using the pronouns, we still play it out, that is at the core of kind of zombies, and why I wanted to think a little bit about how we've created zombies right now, whether we're going through COVID or not. We already have these systems set up.
Well, that's a striking story. I mean, I just think about the point of being on those is to have fun, right? And to enjoy your time with your friends, and for that to be a, reason for kicking somebody off because they're being loud. I mean, how many loud people are all the time, like in bars and restaurants, at least in the before times, making it hard for other people to have a conversation.
Absolutely. I mean, it's the same language that's been used, the proverbial we of the nation, talking about Black folks, talking about immigrant folks, right? It's the they, the them, the gangs, the thugs, the animals, right? The ways in which all of this language is actively either animalizing or dehumanizing, such that we don't see these people as fellow humans. Right?
Even like the use of the term, calling coronavirus the China virus. Right? Yeah. I mean, when we think about zombie, the genre of zombie, what we're concerned about often is a fungus or a virus. It's something that can be spread or caught, and it's coming from somewhere that is not you, and it's putting you at risk. So even framing in that particular way is really diving headfirst into that kind of dehumanizing language.
And I think it's gotten worse historically in zombie films and zombie narratives. Talking about this idea of zombies being from some kind of parasite is actually something that early emerged in the late 1990s and early 2000s that we've now adopted. And so I think we've actually moved past the horde into something even more animalistic and derogatory and dehumanizing. I call the zombies we see in something like World War Z, right? Where they're incredibly fast moving, they swarm on top of each other. I call those hive zombies because they act like insects. So it's like we're going even a step down from being like mammals, and now we're back into like this insect mode. And it's, I think, part of a result of the things we're talking about, and also issues like over population and globalization, and this idea of, it's like we're now not just fear the horde, we feel the hive. That there's this like group mentality.
Let me say though, as an evolutionary biologist, some of the best examples of cooperation are social insects. So, maybe they're cooperating with each other.
I mean, if they're cooperating to spread their virus, then the hive is working incredibly effectively in those narratives.
And those same issues are happening right now in our political world, right? So the ways in which you talk about like the mobs of people, right? I mean, again, to otherwise and to make it seem that they're scary, right? Mobs and hives, those are things that I'm running, right? So that language, not only so that we fear like the undead, but currently in our moment, so that we fear our neighbors, right? We feel our compatriots.
Yeah. Robin, any last words for us? What should we be thinking about as we're moving forward in this challenging time?
I mean, I guess I would think that we always need to be really careful about who we think the zombies are. And I think that's one thing that makes zombie in fiction and zombies in life just this always relevant, always resonant topic to think about and to be scared of and to consider our vulnerability, because we're not just vulnerable, speaking now as like a Black woman scientist, not just vulnerable, we're not just vulnerable or we shouldn't be worried necessarily about some outside zombies coming in and threatening us, which is kind of how a lot of the films start out. But what you really kind of learn is that you yourself can be the zombie, or other people might label you as the zombie. And so I think always keeping that at the forefront is like, who are we labeling as the outsider, the scary outsider, I think is perhaps something we need to keep at the forefront of our minds at this moment where, as you said, Athena, cooperation is key.
Thank you, Robin. Emily, do you have any last words for us?
I think my last words are just what I would say about all monsters, right? Is that monsters exist because someone in a position of power is saying, this is good, this is evil, you are bad, I am good, or it's making they, them mentality. One person's monster could be another person's hero. It just depends on the lens you're viewing it through.
Thanks, Emily. Ms. Ilikazi.
I will say that even as people are made into the other, right, the undead, the zombie, that we have to remember, right, because we might be the ones who have been made into the zombie or the other. Not to forget that we see throughout zombie movies that the other fights back.
Thank you, Ms. Ilikazi. And thank you, Emily, also. And Robin, what an important topic. Thanks for sharing your brains with us on this one. And we're really excited to have a section now where we get to look at the truth behind conspiracy theories. So here to talk with us right now is the creator of the podcast American Hysteria, Chelsey Weber-Smith. Chelsey, tell us, what inspired you to create American Hysteria?
Well, thank you so much for having me on, by the way. And this talk was so cool. And I just have so many things to say. So I'm very excited about these topics. I got into this work kind of as a reaction to being raised with a father who was really into conspiracy theories and prepping and the end of the world and very fantastical thinking. And so that kind of infected me, right? Very new age stuff, which I am no longer personally subscribed to, but it really made me stressed out because I started to get into things like the Illuminati. And eventually, if you go far enough into those, it all turns into terror around the other, which is often Jewish folks and often Black folks. And queer folks. So I started to get more into, when I started to see the darker underbelly, I've always been really interested in psychology and sociology. So my interest then changed to, okay, if I don't believe in this stuff, why do so many people believe in it? And how is it dangerous? And then also sort of how does it get filtered through these lenses that we have in our community? I mean, not even the lenses, right, in our nation, but things like white supremacy, things like patriarchy and the nuclear family and all of the hierarchies and political systems that we have. So yeah, I went from a believer into someone that just wanted to figure out what on earth is going on and has been going on, because this is nothing new.
Chelsey, could you give us a quick crash course on conspiracy theories? So, maybe kind of hitting on like Illuminati, QAnon. Is there a relationship? How did it start? Just, for those of us who don't know that much about conspiracy theories and their history.
Definitely. So can I talk about QAnon? Yes, I can. But I think the important thing is to go back to this Illuminati thing. And I think a lot of you will probably remember this. The word's not used as much anymore because it got like really goofy and funny when everybody was talking about Justin Bieber being in the Illuminati and Beyonce and Lady Gaga and all of that kind of stuff. And it got sort of like it became a parody of itself. But now we have this thing called the deep state. And what these two things have in common is that they are a elite group of people who control everything from the media to Hollywood to politics to our world banks. And so the idea behind this story, in addition to that, is often super duper anti-Semitic. So it's usually, you hear it now. And if you're paying attention to QAnon, you'll hear about George Soros. And he is a Jewish big donor to liberal causes. And so he's become sort of the puppet master. There's always a puppet master. And a lot of times in these conspiracies stretching back, those people are these elite Jewish people. And I can explain why that is as well eventually. But right now, I think the other really important thing is that what happens then is that there are these arms of control going down. And so you'll hear now, even with QAnon, things like the Jewish elite, a Jewish cabal, or the deep state, which is kind of a dog whistle code, or the Democrats, sure, are controlling people like Black Lives Matter protesters. A real whopper I heard the other day is that the Jewish deep state is controlling Black Lives Matter, making them make people wear masks to hide their faces from the Christian God. So we've got these weird kind of tentacles of control and these different types of puppet masters. But I think, and I won't go too deep into this because I think we'll keep talking about it, but what I have found is at the heart of all of these conspiracy theories are two things. One, the fear of the white genocide. And the white genocide is, if you go into conspiracy theories deep enough, you will hear this word, and it is the fear that people who are non-white, people of color, let's say people who are non-straight white men, are essentially coming to take power away from the white patriot, and the way that that is most prolifically happening is through dropping birth rates of white people, and that immigrants and Black folks are coming in and racial mixing in order to kind of like take over power. It's very, very dark. But the second part of it is that these conspiracy theories, often people don't go quite that deep, and so they're getting like the tip of the iceberg of these different things. And conspiracy theories, they're really these mechanisms of personal control. Like if we're going to look at these folks who push these terrifying conspiracy theories in a way that seeks to understand how on earth they got to this belief, it has a lot to do with control, not just politically, not just socially, but emotionally. Because as funny as it is to imagine this terrifying, often we'll get into this, satanic cult that controls, the entire world, you would think that that's scary, but actually what it is comforting, because what it does is it takes these complicated social problems, these really, really difficult to solve systemic issues, poverty, anything you can then say is because of this shadow group. And in fact, that can be comforting, because it's more comforting to believe that someone's in control than the fact that this is all chaos that we're all contributing to.
So go ahead, Dave.
Oh, I was just going to say, do these tend to also give the people who believe them control as well, or is it just, or are they explanatory?
No, I think that it is it's a personal control, in that you can say, well, one, we really love to have information that other people don't have. We really enjoy to be in on a secret, right? And that's why secret societies are such a huge part of conspiracy theories, and they always have been. But it gives you this feeling that at least someone's in control. And if there is sort of this, here's this group, if we can just figure out how to take them down. And with QAnon, it's supposed to be, if you don't know, a satanic cult, which we'll get into, of Democrats, Hollywood people. Tom Hanks is a big one, apparently, who are controlling everything. And if you can go after these people who are allegedly in control of everything, then you have a very clear mission. And for QAnon, Donald Trump is that person who is sort of this beefed up superhero who's going to take down all of these elite pedophiles in the government. And so you get this chance to really ignore systemic issues. And I think that we have a problem with that sometimes in general, where we want to go after a person who's expressing white supremacy or other patriarchy, other systems, anti-transness, versus knowing, believing, and dealing with the fact that these are systemic issues, and whatever our enemy is probably not someone that's going to, if we take that person down, suddenly the world is going to be, or we take that shadow group down, somehow the world is then going to become whatever it is that person wants, when we just sure don't want to tackle systemic issues because they are very, very complicated and boring. It's not a story about a cult that you get to take down. It's a story of lobbying for the rights of the people in your group and other groups. So
did QAnon, is this, because whenever I hear it, it always, my first thought is, oh, this was astroturfed, right? Clearly this is a get out the vote. Is this a thing that's sort of grown organically, or is this a thing that is I don't want to be like countering it with another conspiracy theory, but it seems like there's a real winner, like, right? It helps Donald Trump, this conspiracy theory. And so then I think it always raises in my mind, is this a thing that's just happened by chance, or do we know where QAnon's come from, or what, or is it just from some weird psychological need for control?
Well, this particular story is not new. The idea that, as I mentioned, I mean, the Illuminati itself goes all the way back to the 1700s in Bavaria. That's a complicated story that I won't tell, but basically, since Henry Ford is the real villain of American conspiracy theories, in my opinion. He's the one that brought over this text called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and that text is the foundation of things like QAnon if you go deep enough, right? So this document is a forgery, possibly a play. There's a couple different theories, but it's a fake document, a forgery, a conspiracy theory document that says it's essentially proof that this group of rich Jewish people is controlling the world. And then Henry Ford sent that out all over the nation with his super anti-Semitic press. And so that's kind of the heart of the American story. But QAnon with the state, because right now, especially, I mean, I cannot believe that satanic cults, which I am an expert in, is so profoundly inside of our political conversations right now. I mean, Trump was just asked point blank to deny the existence of a satanic cult of pedophiles within the government, and all he could say is, well, I hear that they're going after pedophiles and I like that, you know? And so, but this idea of the satanic pedophile cult also goes all the way back to baby sacrifices, and that was used against Jewish people. The idea that babies were being sacrificed and taken was something that colonists said about indigenous people. It's something that people said about enslaved people who were revolting against slavery. And so it's this long story of whether you say, oh, these babies are being sacrificed, which QAnon does say, or you're saying these satanic pedophiles are doing all of these horrible things. You can also trace that back to the 1980s during the Satanic Panic, which would take a very long time to explain. But essentially, our entire nation was engulfed in this belief that there were satanic cults operating all over the country, and that included and was sort of orchestrated by this top tier satanic cult, which was, again, the Jewish Illuminati. And so, and the satanic cult panic it ended up with people being in prison because people were willing to believe that teachers in these daycare centers were satanic ritual abusing these children to the point where there were apparently horses being sacrificed. There was an abandoned lot that, yeah, thank you, Emily McMartin. She knows the McMartin preschool trial. That was the big, huge trial of this. You know, these children, it's very complicated to talk about, but these children were kind of coaxed into giving these sensational answers, witches flying around, just the worst. I won't say all of it, just imagine the worst things that a person could imagine. And that's what we were dealing with. And of course, without a stitch of physical evidence. And people went to trial and people went to prison for 20 years for allegedly doing this, even though there was no evidence. And that was in large part due to Americans just desire to believe in these things. But I think it's important too, what we do on our show is look at the social conditions at that moment. And at that moment in the 1980s, women had gained a lot of rights through the victims' rights movement and through Roe v. Wade and all of these different very scary and destabilizing movements forward for those who are in power, straight white people. And that helped, I think, facilitate this panic, because the fact that these satanic cults were operating in daycares meant that who was really at fault? The satanic cult, you don't even count them. They're not human. They're not worth consideration. But who put those people there? It was women, right? It was mothers. And so I don't think it's a coincidence that this particular conspiracy and panic came at a time when a group who had been previously denied equal rights had made these movements forward. And I think you can see that again and again. And the story of you just can't talk about conspiracies without talking about the satanic baby murderer, because it goes all the way back to, I mean, Christians were once called that. Jewish people were once called that. And I think it's really key when we talk about monsters and zombies and things like that to realize that in our cultural moment, and really in any cultural moment, the worst thing that you can be, the very most dehumanizing evil that we can imagine, is the elite satanic child abuser or killer. And so that story comes back up again and again. And I think it's that same thing we've been talking about, that Robin was talking about. It may not be exactly the language of being zombified, but it is the language of the monstrous, for sure.
Yeah, Chelsey, I'm going to bring Mozilla Kazi into the conversation. Mozilla Kazi, you've been commenting away. I want to give you a chance to say your piece and ask Chelsey some of the questions that you've been typing into our feed.
Okay, well, it's been super fascinating, Chelsey. I am wondering, well, one thing that comes to mind, especially in this current moment of being concerned about pedophilia and abuse of children, is the ways in which immigrant children are being taken from their parents and abused, right? So how do we align actual news coming out about this abuse of children with the conspiracy theory around this rich cabal of folks?
That is such an important question. So thank you for asking. Basically, what conspiracy theories often do, and moral panics, and the way we're going to define a moral panic is sort of when we freak out about something that has to do with our cultural morality to the where something doesn't exist at all, or else it's overblown to the point of being cartoonish and ridiculous. So we did an episode called Stranger Danger, and all of us grew up with that confidence, right, that we were going to be taken at any moment. Well, let me rephrase that. If you were a white suburban kid, that was told to you in a very particular and sensationalized way, which of course ignores the complete and utter reality that those who are at risk are people of color, children of color, and children who are queer and forced out of their homes, and all of those different things that don't quite fit our media narratives. And so when we talk about stranger danger, which is part of the conspiracy, I think, is people being stolen, child trafficking, things like that. But what the problem is you're telling the wrong story. And the real story, which we talk about in our stranger danger episode, is how that story has been used. So indigenous people, you had to be the tallest tales in the colonial villages was that indigenous people were coming to take your children. And so in our stranger danger episode, we made very clear that people are taking children, right? But it does not look like the sensational kidnapping stranger in the van calling with candy. It looks like government policy that takes our children away from, that takes immigrant children away from their parents. And you could go back to the hypocrisy of saying that children were being stolen by indigenous people when indigenous children were being stolen from their tribes and put into white schools and white communities. And so I think that is such an important thing, is that conspiracy theories often hold this grain of truth, but it's twisted through the systemic power, and it's twisted through our cultural narratives. And so what ends up happening is the truly at-risk people are so... It's not the story that we've always told. We've always told the story of white women and white children being the ones who are in danger. And I could talk a lot about that as well, but let's make sure that I'm not taking up too much time. Hopefully that answers your question.
Absolutely. It kind of highlights a certain kind of upside down of the storytelling,
Yes.
right? Like,
Yes.
Sure, it is the story, but not that story. I wanted to ask you too, because of the role of anti-Semitism in this conspiracy theory and the ways in which that's been pervasive in other conspiracy theories. Why? I mean, why do we see this kind of come back, this return to Jewish people as centered here?
I wish I knew that. I've been trying to figure that out. And I think, my best guess would be something to do with Jesus, right? Something to do with this idea that Jewish people were responsible for the death of the savior. This is where I'm going. I'm not certain. And the reason why is mainly because I stick to American stories. And so I'm not always 100% certain how they got started, but I do know that the most important moment for that here was what I talked about with the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And that text is perfect fascism fodder because it went on to inspire Hitler. He used that story in his speeches, and he had a full-size portrait of Henry Ford on his desk, which a lot of people didn't know. So I think I can't tell you the origins, but my guess, my feeling would be that it has something to do with this weird Christian thing. But I think you also hit on something that feels possibly true as well. And I like to think of conspiracy theories as an abusive relationship. So what happens in a conspiracy theory is you take the person who has less power than you, especially say we'll use colonists, colonizers, and indigenous folks, indigenous tribes. They became satanic agents. They became murderous, evil people, right? And white people became the victims, right? And so we see this in abusive relationships. We see someone who's an abuser always finding a way to be the abused. And this serves us because it lets us do whatever we want, right? And we always have a good reason. And so I think if you have this embedded, strange, intense, puritanical Christianity, you're going to have this ingrained villain, whether or not you even are aware of it, through that narrative that has just been pulled through the generations for better and for worse. And so, yeah, I think really it's just about switching the ideas of power and creating this mirage so that you can continue on business as usual with your power.
Extremely interesting. I feel like I could just listen to you talk about this and keep going. I'll have to check out the podcast for sure.
Yeah. Chelsey, what's the best way for people to hear more from you? Is it your website, your podcast?
Yeah, just go to American Hysteria. You can find it you can go to americanhysteria.com, or you can just anywhere you listen to podcasts. We'll be there. And our new season starts on Monday. And our first episode is dissecting how true crime has affected American culture. So don't miss that.
Awesome. Chelsey, thanks so much for joining us. And Ms. Olakazi, thanks so much for all of your questions. I'm going to put you guys both in the backstage of the studio, and I'm going to bring our next guest on. So we're now joined by New York Times journalist Sam Kestenbaum, an expert in religious movements. Sam, welcome to Undead Live. I want to first ask you, is there a link here between conspiracy theories and fringe religious movements?
Yes, certainly. And I want to thank Chelsey for this kind of helping establish some kind of theoretical kind of groundwork here for how we're going to think about how we might think about conspiracy theories. And, and I want to kind of add to that, this idea of the kind of esoteric and exoteric, that is the kind of meaning at face value of events, of texts, and the hidden meaning. And within the religious context, the kind of esoteric meanings behind, say, the Book of Revelation or other texts within the Bible, there's the kind of face value meaning of the words. Then there's the meaning below that one needs kind of a special lens to understand. And in a lot of ways, we can think about conspiracy theorizing as a kind of like a folk kind of esotericism of current events. So, that's one way that I might think about conspiracy theorizing as a kind of a religious form of folk theorizing about events in the media or current events today. So there's a kind of consonance, and I think we see that when we look at kind of the appeal of some of these kind of popular conspiracy theories with folks who are kind of already involved in religious movements. That is, much has been made about the appeal of QAnon to evangelicals, also the kind of the what people have termed kind of conspirituality, that is the kind of the blending of QAnon with all sorts of New Age ideas. So yeah, I mean, I think these are kind of fellow travelers, and folks can easily kind of jump from one kind of conspiracy theory to another, or from a religious movement to a conspiracy theory. So these are undoubtedly, in my mind, kind of a form of folk religion, for sure.
That's fascinating, Sam. So you're saying there's kind of a parallel between the kind of meaning making that has happened in societies throughout history with mythology, and what's happening now today with conspiracy theories.
Totally. I mean, I think that's a kind of maybe a slightly uncomfortable way to think about it. And if we are if we want to kind of valorize or ennoble kind of religious forms, which we don't have to do, to think about conspiracy theories as a kind of religious form, I think is actually quite helpful. And especially in keeping with the theme of this conference, the kind of enduring appeal of kind of apocalypticism within these conspiracy theories, which I think, as Chelsey pointed out helpfully, these are a way of kind of making sense and the centering of the kind of believer within this kind of cosmic drama. So yeah, basically what I mean is apocalypticism is kind of the enduring kind of religious conspiracy. That is, if we're going to understand a conspiracy theory as a kind of a lens with which to understand current events, the kind of enduring appeal of the apocalypse as something to kind of read into current events as kind of being events leading up to the apocalypse. I mean, this has been with us since longer, but certainly within American religion since the 19th century, and the kind of efflorescence of kind of end times literature from evangelical, be it the kind of Left Behind series, or all sorts of kind of popular evangelical books which read into current events as signs of the apocalypse soon to come. We might not call this a conspiracy theory, but if we're understanding conspiracy theory as a kind of a form of esoteric knowledge, then I would say these are not dissimilar at all.
So Sam, so if we're thinking about conspiracy theories in this way, how does that change like how we might approach them in terms of our sort of the broader societal conversation around conspiracy theories?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I like to point out is that, no one kind of social or political quarter has a monopoly on this kind of thinking, on a kind of apocalyptic thinking or conspiratorial thinking. And if I might, one of the things that I hope to be able to kind of add to this conversation here is that, most of what I'm kind of giving to you now is drawn from reporting that I've done within communities. That is, be they kind of extensive reporting on Black Hebrew Israelite groups, or kind of broadly what we call New Age groups, or kind of evangelical, as I've described, kind of evangelical kind of doomsday authors, or kind of entrepreneurial doomsday prophets coming out of the kind of charismatic Pentecostal world. This kind of way of theorizing about the world, no one kind of quarter has monopoly on it, and it is this kind of way of thinking about oneself as embattled, but yet kind of in power, yet and kind of in part of history that is like not disempowered by all the chaos around you, but kind of at the center of this cosmic drama and able to kind of do things within it. And if I might just kind of give some examples, like, I guess what I mean is like the American apocalypticist, or the American conspiracy theorist, comes in all sorts of flavors. Like I described, the Black Hebrew Israelite, maybe envisioning kind of a grand racial conspiracy that has robbed them of their ancient heritage. That is kind of the true children of Israel. So it's a kind of a way that it's a kind of a similar formulation that shared with the Nation of Islam, Rastafari, etc. of Black peoples being the true children of Israel. But kind of in their cosmology, right, a grand racial reckoning is coming, and they are playing a role in that. Within some groups, UFOs, Black angels will soon descend and usher in this new era of, in some cases, white slavery, in which the Black Israelites will kind of ascend, will assume their true place as in central to the story, or shifting like the way that I wrote about Marianne Williamson when she was running for president, and got deep into this text that she is a kind of evangelist for A Course in Miracles, which is the supposedly channeled text from Jesus, that this new revelation from Jesus delivered to a Jewish woman in New York in the 1970s. It's another thing, but within within that kind of milieu, Marianne Williamson is talking about kind of ushering in a broad kind of change in consciousness. That is, if we all kind of change our way of thinking, we might usher in a new and enlightened age. So for me, this is a kind of a new age apocalypticism in its own way, in that they are kind of ushering in a new dispensation of time through their thinking. And I could go on with other groups, but I think just to kind of give two seemingly like disparate kind of cultural examples of people engaging in a kind of an apocalyptic thinking, and which I think also appeals to kind of assuaging concerns about your place in the world, as I think others have in this dispatch here tonight have pointed to. That is, like, a Black Israelite might say, they're no longer a kind of surveilled, minoritized, a Black man living in Harlem, Chicago, wherever. You're in fact heir to a sacred heritage, and your time will soon be realized. Or if you're, to caricature, if you're kind of a wealthy white New Ager, your kind of malaise of living kind of a middle class life in, say, California, to caricature, you are in kind of engaging in mindfulness meditation. You are actually helping to usher in the new age, the new enlightened age. So it places one at the kind of center of a kind of a cosmic story, and assuages doubts they may have about their place in the world.
So we happen to have someone who read A Course in Miracles, waiting right backstage. So
yeah, let's bring in Chelsey.
I was Chelsey, up.
What do you think about this idea that that spirituality and sort of mythology is part of what we're seeing now with conspiracy theories?
You just coined the best word, Sam. I don't know if you coined that, but the conspirituality.
I can't take credit.
Okay, all right. It's good. Yeah, I'm going to be using that. But I mean, from my own experience, I was a new age person for like quite a while. And a lot of it was through making this show that I lost. I like kind of shed that, because it is such a like prosperity gospel knockoff, meaning, you create your own reality, and you do, that anything that you have, you've somehow earned through some type of perfect spiritual love or some nonsense like that. But I do think, I mean, I was I was in my teens and early 20s in my conspiracy theory days when Bush was president. And all the way up, I find in my own experience and my work that Occupy Wall Street was a little bit of a turning point, because we had a lot of conspiracy theories that occupy Wall Street, and about the Illuminati, and about it didn't take on its anti-Semitic bent as much as it does now, which isn't surprising, but it, if you got too deep, it would. But I do think, being there and listening and believing in certain conspiracy theories, I think it's in every single community, and none of us would ever be immune to it. And certainly not myself, and I've never been even close to conservative.
Yeah, Sam.
Right. Totally. Yeah. I mean, I think that, even as a category, conspiracy theory, right, is, has a kind of like a disparaging term. Nobody's going to kind of admit to being a conspiracy theorist, right? You're part of the truth community. You're part of, et cetera, et cetera. It's a pejorative. It's a pejorative category, or what we described there. You're doing the research. You're just asking some questions. So yeah, it's a super kind of fluid and complicated category that certainly that has purchase on the left, has purchase on the right. I guess that's the kind of the main thing I kind of want to think I might contribute to or try to add here, is that it has utter purchase as a way of thinking among all sorts of groups, and for different reasons. Sometimes we kind of applaud the kind of democratization of media, of kind of religious forms, of this kind of anti-authoritarian style of American media, celebrity, whatever. But the one effect of that is that I think it produces these sorts of forms of knowing or fear mongering, because authority is so kind of diffuse, if that makes sense. And this sort of, I really try to think of it as a kind of like a folk social theorizing, is kind of open to any and all. And sometimes it can look uglier depending on where we sit on the political spectrum.
So Pam has a, I don't know if it's tongue in cheek or not, but a question here. Do you think that a new religion will rise like a phoenix from the ashes of this moment? She's suggesting that maybe it would be called the Church of Hysteria. What do you think, Chelsey?
My worry is just that we're going to have another revival, because it's like another youth revival. I don't know. I don't see anything. I think we've moved on from religion. The positive things that could come out of it would hopefully be more of a not even worship, but just a respect of science and evidence, and those types of things. So I think obviously we're seeing so much pushback on conspiracy theories, and I think it's really going to highlight the opposite of them, hopefully. But I am worried. I'm most worried about the youth, because I think that there is, you know what? I'm going to leave it at that. I'm not going to talk about the youth right now, but you can come and listen to American Hysteria for more talk on the youth. But
all right. So any final words of advice, Chelsey, for us as we, move forward with the challenging situation that we're in with the, zombie apocalypse and, conspiracy theories arising around us? What should we keep in mind to keep ourselves, our minds safe, perhaps?
Well, hopefully people watching here feel generally safe in their minds. And maybe the question is, how do we approach those who have bought into these things? And it's not easy. You can't just say, here's a list of evidence. Here's why this is bonkers. You can't just say that. You have to come. In fact, studies continuously show that the more people are presented with counter evidence to their point, like actual evidence, they will double down. So I think the best question you can, or the best thing you can do for people in your life that may be going down this route, is sort of the Socrates line of questioning, where you say, oh, okay, well, why do you think that? And okay, so if you're saying that, and just approach it, allow yourself to go there with them. It doesn't mean that you believe it. It doesn't mean that you even support it. But if you can go there with them, which again is what we try to do with the show, we try to go there with people, you can start to perhaps just at least crack that terrifying shell. Yeah.
So that sounds really nice. It is time consuming. Is there any sort of chip I could just put in their brain? Just sort of.
We're working on it.
Okay, cool.
We're working on it.
Thank you, Chelsey. And thank you, Sam. Thank you to all of our guests this evening. And thank you all for joining us for the evening edition of Undead Live. Don't forget to join us later this evening for No Brainer Zombie Quiz Night hosted by Trivial Dispute. You can sign up. You need to do that at least an hour before the trivia starts so that you can get put into your groups. So sign up now, and we will be back here on Channel Z at 7 with our featured speakers for the day and our musical guest, Baba Brinkman, on Late Night Brains. In the meantime, don't forget to share those brains.
It's crazy, but it seems so logical. I can't deny that there is something supernatural with you. Makes me act the way I do.